The hum of the fluorescent lights in the community hall felt wrong. Not too loud, not flickering, just out of sync with the quiet certainty that had settled in my bones. It was the annual reunion for the Northwood High Class of '68, and I'd been coming for 57 years. This time, though, something was different. It began with a laugh, one I'd heard 1,000 times, Joan's high, almost girlish giggle, as she leaned into Robert, her husband. Nothing unusual except for the way his hand lingered on her arm, a fraction of a second too long, and the almost imperceptible glance she shot across the room. It was nothing. A blink and you miss it moment. But my body registered it, not as a shock, but as the final tiny piece clicking into a long-dormed puzzle. My name's Eleanor. I'm 75, and I've lived in a small, quiet town in northern Vermont my entire life. If you've ever stayed silent just to keep peace, you'll understand. I remember standing by the punch bowl, stirring the bright red liquid with a ladle, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The conversations around me were a familiar drone of updated grandchildren counts and mild complaints about rising property taxes. Joan and Robert moved through the room, separate now, mingling as they always did. I watched Joan, my best friend since kindergarten, her silver hair styled just so, her smile easy and practiced. She caught my eye and offered a warm wave. I smiled back, a genuine smile, because in that moment, the certainty I felt wasn't bitter. It was simply true. For decades, I had carried a weight, an unspoken understanding that something was off, but I could never quite place it. It was like living in a house where the floorboards creaked in a pattern that made no sense, or a melody that always resolved to the wrong chord. You learn to ignore it, to live with the dissonance, because acknowledging it meant tearing down the walls. And who wants to tear down a perfectly good life, a perfectly good friendship based on a feeling? I thought back to so many small instances, threads that had seemed insignificant on their own, but now wove into a tapestry I finally understood. The way Joan would sometimes forget details I'd told her, details about my life, my struggles, as if my experiences were interchangeable with someone else's, or the casual ease with which she'd dismiss my concerns, always with a kind word, always with a gentle touch, but never truly validating what I felt. It was always about a pivot, a subtle redirection back to her or to a shared memory that suited her narrative. And I, being me, always let it slide. Always. I told myself it was just Joan being Joan, a little self-absorbed, but well-meaning. And it was easier to believe that than to confront the unsettling feeling that prickled at the edges of my awareness. The punch tasted sweet and artificial, a familiar flavor from countless reunions past. I watched the room, the faces around me, the years etched on them, the stories held within their tired eyes. We had all lived so much, experienced so much, and yet, how much of it had we truly seen, truly acknowledged in each other? How much of it had we simply glossed over for comfort, for peace, for the illusion of belonging? I remember a conversation with my mother years ago when I was in my 30s. I was upset about something Joan had done, a small slight but one that had stung. My mother, wise and quiet, had simply looked at me and said, "Eleanor, some people build their happiness on the foundation of others' silence." I hadn't understood it then, not fully. I had dismissed it as her usual cryptic wisdom. But standing there, at the punch bowl, the words resonated with a clarity that felt almost painful. The truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it's just a whisper, a quiet click, the soft closing of a door you didn't even realize was open. And when it came for me, it didn't bring anger. It brought a profound sense of calm, a quiet understanding that the time for silence was over. Not with a shout, not with a confrontation, just over. That quiet click, as I called it, wasn't a sudden revelation of something new, but rather the alignment of countless small pieces that had always been there, just out of focus. It wasn't about what Joan did that morning, but what she had always done, subtly, elegantly, to keep the spotlight on herself, to ensure her narrative remained the dominant one. I saw it in the way she'd steer conversations, not abruptly, but gently, like a skilled shepherd guiding a flock. If I ever started talking about a personal achievement, a new skill I was learning, or even a challenge I was overcoming, Joan would listen, nod empathetically, and then, with an almost imperceptible shift, bring it back to a similar experience she had, or a common acquaintance who had done something more notable. It wasn't malicious. It was just Joan. And I, always the quiet one, always the supporter, found myself nodding along, letting my own moment fade into the background. I remembered my excitement 30 years ago when I finally published a short collection of local histories, something I'd poured years of research and passion into. I'd called Joan bubbling with pride, expecting her usual enthusiastic response. She had been warm, genuinely so, congratulating me. Then, within minutes, she was telling me about her nephew, a distant cousin really, who just landed a book deal with a major New York publisher. My small self-published triumph felt diminished. Not because she meant it to be, but because that was the pattern. Her light always shone brighter, or at least she always made sure it appeared to. I accepted it, year after year. I accepted being the dependable friend, the listener, the one who didn't demand much attention. It felt natural, comfortable even. I told myself it was my personality. I was an introvert. I preferred the background. And in many ways that was true. But there's a difference between choosing the background and being subtly, consistently pushed into it. I had conflated the two for so long. The cost of that acceptance was gradual, almost imperceptible, like the slow erosion of a riverbank. I stopped sharing my deeper thoughts, my more vulnerable moments, because I learned they would either be gently redirected or met with a well-meaning platitude that didn't quite land. My voice, when I did speak up about something important to me, became smaller, quieter, almost apologetic. I started to pre-filter my experiences, considering whether they were interesting enough or important enough to warrant Joan's full attention, which of course they rarely were by her unspoken standards. I even remember turning down an opportunity to teach a local history class at the community college because Joan had expressed an interest in taking up painting, and I felt I should be available to support her new hobby, to go to art supply stores with her, to listen to her creative struggles. It seemed so natural at the time, such a small sacrifice for a friend. But looking back, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a surrender of a piece of myself, a quiet, almost unconscious ceding of my own desires for the sake of maintaining a comfortable equilibrium in our friendship. The weight of all these small surrenders accumulated. It wasn't a sudden burden, but a slow, creeping pressure, like living under a perpetually low ceiling. I found myself feeling tired more often, a kind of weariness that sleep couldn't fix. It was a weariness of the spirit, a quiet exhaustion from constantly trying to fit myself into a space that was never quite my own unique shape. My own aspirations, my own quiet joys and sorrows had to be trimmed, rounded, smoothed to avoid disrupting the carefully maintained facade of our intertwined lives. And the worst part? I loved her. Genuinely. I still did. This wasn't about hatred or bitterness. It was about seeing clearly, finally, the dynamic that had defined so much of my adult life. It was about understanding that love, even deep affection, could coexist with an imbalance that slowly, irrevocably, diminished one person while elevating another. The silence I had chosen for peace, for friendship, had become a cage I had unknowingly built for myself, brick by imperceptible brick. And that morning, as I stirred the punch, the first brick had simply dissolved. The cost wasn't just emotional, it was a physical sensation, a lingering tension in my shoulders, a subtle clenching in my jaw that I'd long attributed to the ordinary stresses of life. But now I saw it differently. It was the physical manifestation of holding my breath, of waiting, of perpetually being poised to adjust myself to someone else's needs or narratives. My natural softness, the gentle curiosity I'd had as a younger woman, had hardened, not into anger, but into a kind of protective shell. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, perhaps, but I felt it, like a perpetual dull ache beneath the surface. I remembered a specific instance decades ago. I was in my late 50s and I'd finally decided to take a painting class, something I'd always wanted to do but had pushed aside for various reasons, mostly revolving around family obligations and, unknowingly then, Joan's gravitational pull. I was so excited, showing her my first few clumsy attempts, canvases filled with vibrant, messy colors. She'd smiled, praised my enthusiasm, and then, almost immediately, launched into a detailed critique of the local art scene, how impossible it was to get into galleries, and how really, unless you were truly gifted, it was just a hobby. Her words weren't meant to wound, I'm sure, but they landed like tiny darts, deflating my fragile confidence. I continued the class, but the joy had dimmed. I finished the course, tucked my canvases away, and didn't pick up a brush again for years. It was a subtle death, a quiet surrender of a nascent passion, all because the air in the room felt too heavy for my small, hopeful flame. This wasn't a singular event, but a pattern, an erosion of identity. My opinions, unless they aligned perfectly with hers, were met with a polite but firm counter-argument, or a gentle chuckle that implied my perspective was charmingly naive. I learned to self-censor, to offer only the most palatable parts of myself, the ones that wouldn't cause a ripple. I became an echo, a reflection of the friendship Joan wanted, rather than the multifaceted woman I was. The years piled up, each one adding another layer to the quiet compromise I'd made with myself. My own needs, my dreams, began to feel indulgent. Why bother pursuing something that would just be met with a subtle deflection or an implied judgment? It was easier, less draining to simply go along, to agree, to be the agreeable friend. And the silence, once a choice for peace, became a habit, then a prison. I lost the cadence of my own thoughts. the unique rhythm of my own voice when it wasn't filtered through the lens of external approval. What truly stung in this belated clarity was the realization that I had enabled it. My quiet compliance had been a tacit agreement, a silent nod to the dynamic. I had allowed my boundaries to become porous, then non-existent, because the alternative felt like conflict, and I had always shied away from conflict. The fear of disrupting the peace, of causing discomfort, even temporary discomfort, outweighed the slow internal bleed of losing myself. I remember my husband, bless his heart, once saying, "Eleanor, you always give so much of yourself. Make sure there's enough left for you." I had just smiled, a little sadly, and changed the subject. Even he, the person closest to me, couldn't fully grasp the intricate dance of quiet appeasement I performed daily. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a slow, gentle fading of who I was, a gradual erosion of the vibrant core I knew I possessed somewhere deep inside. It was the quiet violence of being erased, not by malice, but by the relentless, unquestioned focus of another, and I had let it happen. The air in the hall felt heavy, not with anger, but with the palpable presence of those lost years, those quietly sacrificed pieces of myself. That morning, as the reunion bustled around me, the urge to explain myself, to justify my feelings or my perspective, simply evaporated. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. I had spent so many years trying to make sense of things for others, particularly for Joan, explaining why I felt a certain way or why a particular situation had affected me, always hoping that if I just found the right words, she would finally see it, finally understand me. But those explanations rarely landed. They were usually met with a polite nod, a quick redirection, or a well-meaning but ultimately dismissive platitude. I would walk away from those conversations feeling even more alone, more misunderstood, and strangely as if I had somehow failed to articulate something perfectly obvious. The silence that had settled within me wasn't cold or resentful. It was a quiet, almost profound peace. The need to be heard by her, to be validated by her, had simply lifted. It was like taking off a pair of shoes that had been too tight for decades. The relief wasn't instantaneous agony. It was a slow, delicious unfolding, a widening of space where there had been only constriction. I watched Joan laughing across the room, animated, engaging, just as she always was. And for the first time, I saw her not as the keeper of my emotional equilibrium, but simply as a woman, living her life. Her world didn't need to encompass mine, and mine didn't need to constantly orbit hers. That realization was liberating. It meant I no longer had to anticipate her reactions, no longer had to tailor my experiences to fit into the narrative she preferred. I found myself drifting away from the main crowd towards a quieter corner where a display of old yearbooks lay open. I flipped through the pages, seeing younger versions of faces I now knew so well. There I was, on the swim team, a shy smile, hair pulled back tight, and there was Joan, front and center in every club photo, radiant, confident. A pang, not of jealousy, but of gentle recognition went through me. Even then, she had drawn the light, and even then, I had been content to be in her shadow, to cheer her on from the sidelines. But the sidelines had become too crowded, too uncomfortable. I didn't want to be a spectator in my own life anymore. I didn't want to wait for permission, for acknowledgement, for a cue from someone else to simply be. The waiting had been the hardest part. Waiting for her to ask, to notice, to truly listen without an agenda. Waiting for the reciprocal depth that never quite materialized. And now, the waiting was over. It wasn't a defiance. It was a quiet dissolution. I wasn't going to announce it, wasn't going to confront her, wasn't going to demand anything. Because to demand implied a right that she might not acknowledge, a debt she might not believe she owed. And I realized that the debt wasn't hers to pay anyway. It was mine, for allowing myself to become so small for so long. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. The guilt of being too much, of wanting too much, of needing too much. It was a silent internal revolution, not against anyone else, but against the internalized expectation that I had to constantly accommodate, constantly shrink. The air in the hall seemed to lighten, almost imperceptibly. My shoulders, for the first time in memory, felt a fraction less tense. It was the quiet breath of a woman who had finally, truly let go. The quiet liberation I felt wasn't a sudden burst of joy, but a deep, steady calm, like the surface of a placid lake after a storm has passed. It was the peace of simply being, without the incessant internal chatter of how I should appear, what I should say, or how I should react to maintain a comfortable illusion. My search for peace had always been externally focused, keeping the peace with others, maintaining harmonious relationships, avoiding ripples. But now it was profoundly internal. The peace I sought was no longer dependent on anyone else's actions or perceptions. It was something I generated from within. I had spent so long trying to anticipate the needs and expectations of those around me, particularly Joan, that my own internal compass had grown faint. Now it was recalibrating, pointing firmly inward. I moved through the reunion, no longer feeling the subtle pull to seek out Joan, to fall into our familiar patterns. I spoke to others, genuinely listened to their stories, and found myself sharing anecdotes of my own life, small, ordinary moments that had previously felt unworthy of mention. There was no filter, no self-consciousness. If someone didn't respond with the exact reaction I might have once hoped for, it simply didn't matter. Their reaction was theirs, not a reflection of my worth. This was perhaps the most profound shift, the decoupling of my sense of self from external validation. It was a gentle, almost imperceptible severing of a cord that had tied me to countless unseen approvals and disapprovals. This shift felt less like a dramatic change and more like a quiet recentering. It was the experience of finally standing on my own 2 feet, not leaning on anyone, not bracing for anything. I noticed details I hadn't before. The way the afternoon light streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The quiet murmur of conversations, no longer a backdrop to my internal anxieties, but simply the sound of people connecting. The world felt sharper, more vibrant, as if a thin veil had been lifted from my perception. The colors seemed brighter, the laughter more genuine, the very air lighter in my lungs. The years I had spent quietly accommodating, unknowingly dimming my own light, didn't feel like a waste. They felt like a long, arduous journey that had finally led me to this precise, tranquil moment. Every subtle slight, Every unspoken compromise had, in a strange way, contributed to the deep understanding I now possessed. It was a wisdom born not of textbooks or grand revelations, but of lived experience, distilled through decades of quiet observation. It was the kind of wisdom that settles into your bones, not something you intellectualize, but something you simply know. I thought about the future, not with grand plans or ambitions, but with a gentle curiosity. What would it be like to continue living with this newfound lightness? To speak when I felt moved to speak, to remain silent when silence felt right, without the internal calculus of how it might be perceived. To pursue interests simply because they brought me joy, regardless of whether they would impress anyone else? The prospect felt expansive, like stepping into a vast open field after years of navigating a narrow, overgrown path. It was an invitation, not a demand. There was no need for grand gestures, no need to explain my newfound freedom to anyone. It wasn't for them. It was for me. It was the quiet blossoming of a self that had been patiently waiting, dormant beneath layers of expectation and assumed obligation. I didn't need to be seen as strong or defiant or even particularly brave. I just needed to be. And in that simple state of being, I found a profound and undeniable peace. It was not a performance. It was a presence. A quiet, unwavering presence that hummed gently beneath my skin. A quiet hum that was entirely my own. The reunion began to wind down. People were gathering their coats, exchanging final hugs and promises to keep in touch. Promises that, for most, would fade with the week. I watched Joan and Robert say their goodbyes, their movements fluid, synchronized. There was no bitterness in my gaze, just observation. They were a part of the tapestry of my life, but no longer the central figures around whom my own threads had to be meticulously arranged. I felt a peculiar lightness in my steps as I walked towards the exit, a physical sensation of having shed a great weight. It wasn't about revenge or even about making them understand. It was simply about releasing myself from the invisible bonds I had allowed to tighten over the years. The air outside was cool, a crisp Vermont evening. The stars were beginning to prickle through the darkening sky, vast and indifferent, and in their silent presence, my own quiet truth felt complete. I thought about the choices I had made, the silence I had cultivated. For so long, I had believed that to maintain peace, one had to sacrifice a part of oneself. That compromise was the essence of connection. But I now understood that true peace wasn't the absence of ripples, but the strength to withstand them, to let them pass without being pulled under. It was the quiet knowledge that my worth wasn't contingent on being understood or even fully seen by others. It simply was. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic declaration. There was no need. The silent reckoning had happened within me, and that was enough. My liberation wasn't for public consumption. It was a private ceremony performed in the quiet chambers of my own heart. I didn't need to shatter anyone's illusion of me or of themselves. They could continue their lives undisturbed. My freedom wasn't dependent on their awareness. As I walked to my car, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. A lone car horn sounded in the distance, a fleeting echo in the vast quiet. The world continued its unhurried spin, oblivious to the subtle seismic shift that had occurred within one ordinary woman. and that was perfectly fine. My breath felt deep, full, unconstrained. The tension that had lived in my chest for so long had finally, completely dissolved. I got into my car, the interior cool and familiar. The dashboard lights glowed softly. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was perfect. Nothing changed. And yet I was finally breathing.